This is Jeremy Wentworth-Stanley. I'm the fellow who has a hyphen in my name. The hyphen is silent, but I am anything but that. Respectonomics brings you another episode of Living Economics. This is number 19, and this one is dealing with what's called the model of inflation. Here we are in the first 10 days of June 2026, and it's worth exploring and worth thinking about the big question of what on the earth is going on. My name is Jeremy Wentworth-Stanley. I am your voice of Respectonomics. I'm also your year of Respectonomics, and therefore welcome your comments, criticisms, and ideas. And what we're going to do here is look at the economy today and try and find a middle path through it. The first thing is the markets are in disarray. By that I mean the stock markets, and showing remarkable resilience and strength, followed by remarkable downturns. We got the soothsayers who are out there explaining to us quite categorically that everything's in good order, that we should be buying on the dips, and that things are going to sort themselves out. This is normal cyclical behavior. Then we have the issue of inflation, which is very, very confusing because the inflationary numbers that you're dealing with on the home front, at your kitchen table, at the gas pump, at the insurance bureau, but wherever you happen to be dealing, it has been said to me that, quote, my expenses are up 20%. And I think in many regards that is true. The second part to that equation, though, is the figures that we are being reported and are being handed down to us or handed to us are figures that have remarkable decimalization. They start with a number like 3 or 4, and then they go into 0.1537298%, as though there's some extraordinary accuracy that they can bring to the table. It reminds me of the time when school children are asked something that they have done that they should not have done. And they all come out with exactly the same story with detail beyond imagination, but it's all the same detail. And when you get that kind of detail, the first thing you probably do is say, and how do you validate that? I am completely confused how the consumer price index, the producer price index, and all these other indices that are used come out with calculations that show we're up 3 or 4%. It is much higher than that at the grocery store, and it's certainly much higher than that at the gas pump, and services that, if you go and get a shirt cleaned and pressed and ironed and everything, those prices are up 30 or 40% from 2 years ago. At the same time, there is a school of thought out there that talks about weakening consumer demand. Now, this is where it gets confusing, because if you have inflation on the one hand saying the prices are rising, but on the other hand, you find the consumer who's pulling back. And there's quite a lot of evidence of the consumer pulling back. The numbers on installment debt, and not so much on the debt itself, but on the payment schedules, there's evidence mounting of increasing slowdowns in people's ability to repay their debts on a timely basis. It applies to mortgages, it applies to consumer loans, installment debt, automobile loans, and so on. So you've got that sort of financial drag on the ability of people to be consuming. And at the same time, the consumer today is dealing with these problems. We may not articulate them and start talking about, price earnings multiples in the stock market or something like that. But I think we all experience this nagging fear that something isn't right. The answer is that things are not right. And we should try and come down to 1 or 2 points to clarify this. But what I really want to emphasize on behalf of Respectonomics, on behalf of Living Economics, is that the information that we're getting is very confusing. Now, in the markets generally, we have always been faced with questions. We've got problems that, frankly, the only difference between one problem and another is that they are different. One cycle has one set of problems and the next cycle has another problem. But I think what we're talking about here is much more of a structural deficiency rather than a cyclical one. A cyclical one is the stuff that goes up and down and we all grit our teeth or smile as the case may be. Structural means there is actual destruction going on in demand, in supply, and so on. One of the things that we've noticed is that inflation is being attributed to supply shortages, which to some extent is true. Oil today is higher because it's in a shorter supply than it was, and we're having to draw down on the strategic inventories, as they call them. And as we draw down on those, we effectively reduce the supply or the spare capacity of oil. So to that extent, one might reasonably say prices would be rising. But we've noticed two things. Number one, that line of thinking, the supply shortages, is being used to explain every dynamic of inflation. So instead of it being touted as being an issue of financially orientated. So, for example, credit demand is rising, therefore the price of money is going up. We're hearing more about the supply shortages being the reason for the inflation. And here's another thing. There used to be a resolute, and certainly the last 10 years, a resolute determination to keep inflation down to 2%. That was the given number. I'm not sure any of us really knows why 2% was the figure, why it wasn't 1.8 or 2.1 or 3.1, but it was 2%. Maybe it's easy to say, but it was 2%. And I've noticed that the leadership, either central banks or in the financial governance corridor, that these organizations and individuals are starting to talk down the importance of inflation. And here's the problem. When you talk down inflation, it's a little bit like talking down pregnancy. It's there. And if it continues, it'll come to term. And therefore, the inflation that is in place now could easily be the one that truly comes to term. And when it does, the 1980s were full of terrible inflation and interest rates that went to levels that are, frankly, in today's world, unimaginable. But I think we need to look at more cynically at not only the inflation and the reasons for it, but also look at the less cautious, less robust attitude by the financial leadership. The other thing that's creeping up is artificial intelligence. Now, that in a sense is not an inflationary item per se, although the dollar figures that are invested in it, the billions, and probably now ending in trillions, the trillions that are into artificial intelligence are in one sense inflationary because they constantly draw on the supply of credit. So they have become credit consumers. So we know that. But we also know that artificial intelligence drives up the price of electricity and drives up the price of water. So it can't be considered to be a neutral subject. The thing that we need to come to grips with is we're dealing with stuff that is literally confusing, conflicting, that we really can't just put a straight piece of linear tape to it and say, this is the way it's going. We need to examine the structural weaknesses in the economy. We need to look at the structures literally in the way that they stand and have stood for maybe 25, 50 years and whether they can continue. But one of the key culprits in all of this is the deficits that are now freely exercised by governments on a worldwide basis. Let's not kid ourselves. Deficits have become epidemic. They have become endemic in the sense that they now belong to every government that we seem to come across, whether it's the French, the British, the Americans, the Canadians, the Australians, everybody's got into the debt kick. If you think of the debt in the way like you would a mortgage, the whole concept of the mortgage was you were basically taking a call on your future earnings and you would get a lump sum that would allow you then to be able to buy a house or a residence. That's how the mortgage worked. The principle behind it was that you would be repaying it. And you repaid the loan for two reasons. One was what you would commonly call good financial management. You didn't want to have debt hanging around all the time. And the other reason is that as a mortgage is being repaid, it allows new liquidity to be created, which is then used to fund other mortgages. So, how come mortgages are being increased and made available in huge volumes when people are not actually, and governments are not paying down their mortgages and their debts? And the reason is because the governments are increasing their deficits. And the trouble with increasing deficits is it does, in a sense, directly, you might even say indirectly, but take your pick. The truth of the matter is deficits do affect affordability. And when we find that life has become less affordable, we can draw a straight line on government deficits. Government deficits have been growing, as we all know, in leaps and bounds. And here's a question for all of us. We know that government debt has increased in the magnitude of whatever it might be. It's hard to calculate it, but certainly in excess of the output of the economy. And let's just take the increase in government debt, just take that as a given, and the deficits that go with it. Have our services, in fact, improved correspondingly? Are we getting better roads? Are we getting better education? Are we getting better healthcare? Are we getting better defense? And you think of all the things that go into what governments spend money on, and it is interesting that the incidence of the deficits doesn't seem to correspond with an incidence of improvement or enhancement in the services that we receive. Many people would say the roads are not as good, the healthcare is failing, and education is also failing. So it does beg the question about the efficacy of this government spending and the deficits. We know that the deficits are indirectly inflationary. We know that they are affecting our affordability. And also, let us be clear, the deficits of today could easily become the obligations of our grandchildren. That's an incredibly moral issue that needs to be addressed. The idea behind the original mortgage, when we borrowed money to buy a house or a home, that was based on the idea we would pay off the debt. That was the general principle of it. So the principle that is now being disavowed is the repayment. It is just being rolled over. And you have these fancy expressions that say, oh, the value of the house has gone up. Oh, goody, I can borrow more money. The value of the economy has gone up. Oh, goody, I can borrow more money. It is not good financial plumbing to be doing that. So, all in all, while we find the information today to be confusing and conflicting, we're looking at an inflationary bias that does not appear to be brought under control. And here is one of the things about any economic cycle that we can go through. We've talked about the structural issues and the weaknesses attributable to them, but now we're talking about another thing, that if we then say, well, we believe in cycles, and that is the corresponding truth. In other words, you say, well, things go up and things go down. If we run that through the through the desk, what are the possibilities that we're into rising rates of inflation to be followed cyclically by rising levels of deflation? Deflation is a very nasty animal because it puts the consumer, puts everybody on guard to spend any money at all under the general principle, I can buy it at a lower price in 6 months' time. So bringing inflation under control by bringing the deficits under control seems to be axiomatically important. It does mean that we may have to look at government services that we, let us say, take for granted. I'm not sure which ones they would be, but there may be a case where we have to start containing the level of government service in order to remediate the amount or the incidence of the indebtedness. It is a confusing picture. And I've got one last comment to make. We often talk about financial literacy. And financial literacy means things like I understand the savings and checking and debt and all these things. I know how to make a deposit and so on. And whatever level of financial literacy one may be at, literacy also means not only the ability to read and say that's what it says, it has an undergirding truth of do we understand what those words mean? And I think at the moment, political leaders, particularly, and many of the financial leaders, are in fact exercising great uh, financial grammar, but it is a grammar and a syntax that we don't really understand. And I've come to one conclusion. When I don't understand something, generally speaking, the author of those expressions or comments, those commentaries, the author of those doesn't understand either. There we have it. And on that, I rest my case.